Is that your dad?
Yeah, that's my dad.
This man right here is your father? Right there?
You have a question about that?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
I was wondering if your dad really is an African-American man.
That's a very, I don't know what you're implying.
Are you African-American?
I don't understand the question of, I did tell you that, yes, that's my dad. And he was unable to come in January.
Are your parents, are they white?
Wait, what? The woman you just saw on your screen is Rachel Dolezal, and up until 2015, she was working at the Spokane, Washington chapter of the NAACP. She was a high-ranking member there until an intrepid reporter, presumably based on some suspicions that her colleagues had, did some research and found out that she wasn't a black woman as she had represented to people. She is, in fact, a white woman who grew up in a very white family, but had black adopted siblings. And this story made national news. Everyone seemed to be really angry at Rachel Dolezal. And the question was, is Rachel black or is Rachel white? Rachel, if you ask her, feels very black. She learned at an early age. Her story is complicated, but she really learned to identify with her black siblings more than her white parents. And she says that she kind of went through the world from then on feeling black as kind of a personal experience. But of course, a lot of other things would suggest that she's white. In fact, she had to darken her skin and do her hair cosmetically to make it appear to the world that she was black. So the question is Rachel black or is she white? And I remember that this was one of the experiences that really made me think a lot harder than I ever had about not only what race is, but what we make it mean. Because people, when they're debating whether or not Rachel is black or white, it obviously meant something. Thinking about black Rachel and white Rachel was like thinking about two different Rachels. If you think of her as a white woman, you think of her in a certain way. If you think of her as a black woman, you think of her as a certain way. So when we ask questions about categories like black or white, male, female, even abled, disabled, there's obviously a factual question there. But I also want to talk in this video about how we make these categories mean certain things. So we're going to do two things in this video. First of all, we're going to talk about how human differences become categories that we put people into, and then how we turn these categories that we put people into something that means something socially. So first, let's look at how we categorize people based on differences. And to do that, we might want to look at race first. When we say that a person is black, white, Latinx, or some other racial categorization, there are a lot of facts about the person that we could use to make that determination. We could use their skin color, for instance, but honestly, skin color is actually an awkward one because it doesn't take much digging, and go look at Google if you disagree with me, to find examples of people we call black who have the same skin tones as people we would call white. One of the things I like to do in class is show a picture of basketball player Steph Curry and the actor, Italian-American actor Michael Imperioli. And if you really look at their skin tone, it's the same skin tone. So skin color is probably a non-starter. We could look at other physical characteristics like hair texture and the shape of a person's eyes, but not all black people have the same texture of hair. Not just like not all Asian people have what we call epicanthic folds around the eyes. We could look at a person's actual genome or family lineage, but there are several problems with that, including the fuzziness that are introduced by what we call interracial mating, which has a surprisingly long history. Some even say that race is about your cultural experience. For instance, a senator recently said that there's a difference between black faces and black voices, implying that blackness was more about the voice you have rather than your skin tone or your appearance. But that would mean that Rachel Dolezal, who deliberately chose a black cultural experience, would be black, and some very dark-skinned descendants of African slaves would not be black, and that's weird. Long story short, there are a lot of physical and other features about a person that we can use to determine what race they belong to. and all of them are quite imperfect. Family history, skin color, other physical features, culture, language, the list goes on, and all of those are imperfect and probably insufficient to determine what race a person is in. So what we generally do is that we take all of those differences, we choose some of them, assign importance to those ones, and then we use those to categorize people. The problem is, though, that whichever ones we choose, whether it's physical characteristics or culture or skin tone, we could always have chosen different ones, and different people might choose different categorization criteria altogether. The philosopher John Locke helpfully calls this categorization by choice-inclusive fact. He argues that when we decide, say, whether a fetus is a person or whether a body of water is an inlet or a gulf, we are looking at facts about the things that we want to categorize. But the thing is that we choose which ones are sufficient to categorize one way or another. It's not necessarily obvious which characteristics are the ones we should choose. He writes, "There are several types and many instances of such choice-inclusive facts. All of them involve objective facts along with some decisions, normally social ones, about classification. There are a lot of facts about someone we could use to determine their appropriate racial categorization, but which ones we choose are always up for individual and cultural negotiation." Now, you might think that male-female categorizations are not like this, but they are, at least a bit. There are generally 3 medical criteria that we can use to decide whether someone is male or female. First, we can look at whether their bodies are equipped to produce large gametes, which are eggs, or small gametes, which are sperm. Second, we could look at what chromosomes they have. Are they XX, female, or are they XY, male? And lastly, we could look at the genitalia, but this one isn't always so straightforward, as some humans are born with ambiguous genitalia. Usually, these 3 markers, gamete production, chromosomes, and genitals, align in expected or predictable ways, but sometimes they point us in different directions. A person can have XX female chromosomes but have a penis, for instance, or they can have XY chromosomes but be equipped to produce eggs. And we only discussed the medical criteria for sex assignment, but clearly in the non-medical everyday world, identifying whether someone is male or female involves something other than checking their chromosomes. We look at things like how they're dressed, what their visible physical features convey to us, or how they conform to one gender expression over another. And over the last 30 years or so, things have actually gotten trickier because another criteria for sex assignment has emerged, which is your felt gender identity. When we decide, say, whether a trans woman is a woman, at least enough that she could use a woman's bathroom or compete in women's sports teams, we have a choice-inclusive fact on our hands, just as when we're trying to decide whether Rachel Dolezal is or isn't black. We figure out which of the many criteria we should use, chromosomes, genitals, appearance, gender experience, and invest some of the criteria as the decisive ones. I should briefly mention psychological disorder here because it's another solid representation of how categorization follows this model of choice-inclusive fact and actually involves a bit more judgment than we often think. Let's take attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. The criteria for ADHD lists 2 themes, inattentiveness and hyperactivity. To qualify as sufficiently inattentive for the diagnosis, a person must satisfy 6 or more of 9 possible criteria, things like forgetfulness, lack of follow-through, or planning. To qualify as sufficiently hyperactive, a person must similarly meet 6 or more of 10 possible criteria, things like talkativeness or fidgetiness. And what's more, quite a few of these criteria are actually pretty subjective, like whether a person talks excessively or fidgets inappropriately. Again, to make a categorization or diagnosis of ADHD, we take facts about a person, or maybe more than we want to admit, opinions about a person, and we choose how many of those facts are sufficient for the diagnosis, and we interpret these facts as placing a person into a category. It's not just that you have these symptoms, it's that these symptoms mean you are categorized as ADHD. Certainly facts are involved, but so is a significant amount of choice and interpretation. To quote the philosopher John Locke again, humans are what he calls a valuational species. As he says it, in sorting creatures into groups, we always keep an eye on our needs. Objects open to multiple categorizations, as plants and animals always are, invite our interests and purposes in determining where they belong. Put simply, Humans always categorize with an eye towards some human purpose or need for doing so. We don't just turn facts into categories, but do so for reasons. We give categories significance. When people were abuzz asking whether Rachel Dolezal was black or white, we weren't so much asking about the facts of the matter as much as how we should think about and treat her. When we ask whether a student has a diagnosis of ADHD, we are, in a similar way, mostly asking about how we should think about or treat them. When we ask whether the person in front of us is male or female, we aren't really so much curious about their chromosomes or gamete production, but we want to know how we should refer to them and talk about them and think about them. If you want some great examples of how we imbue categories with significance, you can't really do better than to look up stories of racial passing. Racial passing, which is what Dolezal essentially did, is to live under a racial category other than the one that you'd normally be placed in by society. Generally, this has meant that light-skinned non-white people pass as white. So why would someone pass? Well, because racial categories always have social significance, and historically whiteness has been held in high esteem, has come with more privileges and immunities than non-whiteness. White people would be eligible to have certain jobs, maintain certain friendships, attend certain schools that might not be open to Black, Latinx, or Asian people. As Rachel Dolezal tells it, she feels black, which largely means that she identifies with the black experience more than the white experience, black cultural things more than white cultural things. Passing as black, in some sense, allows her to credibly be closer to those things in a way that would have seemed maybe socially awkward if the world saw her as white. Or take something as seemingly straightforward as sex. Sex is firmly attached to gender roles, or the social expectations that come from being a certain sex. Boys do these things, girls do those things. Girls can wear dresses, boys really can't. Boys are not supposed to be too girly and vice versa. Actually, I'm writing this in 2021, just after the Tokyo Olympics, and the story of weightlifter Laurel Hubbard illustrates the point beautifully. Hubbard was born male but has been living as a female since 2013. The Olympic Committee allowed Hubbard, according to its rules, to compete as a female weightlifter, which caused a huge stir in the media. Everyone wanted to know whether Hubbard was in fact female, or at least female in the ways that would allow her to compete with women. But the question wasn't really motivated by a brute desire to know, but really a need to figure out how to treat Hubbard in terms of the Olympics. Only once we know what category Hubbard falls into can we know how to treat Hubbard. So there are brute facts that make humans different from one another. We don't just invent and come up with these things. We have different skin colors, hair colors, body structures, cultural patterns, and on it goes. But being human, we turn those differences into categorizations. It's our understandable way of making the world easier to navigate. Once we turn these brute facts into category boxes, we imbue some of those categorizations with significance. This person belongs into this category, and that affects how I should interact with her in the following ways. What John Locke says is important because it's so often below our conscious awareness. Differences need to be made into categories, and that's a social project. And categories are made for thoroughly human purposes. There is a reason we all cared so much whether Rachel Dolezal was black or white. And there's a reason we want to know what category we should place people in who have ambiguous gender presentations. For better, worse, or neither, there are differences that, for us humans, make a difference.